Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, episode 2. So again, one of our early episodes. My guest today is Dr. Joel Greenwald of Greenwald Wealth Management in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. Dr. Greenwald was a practicing physician for 10 years prior to transitioning into becoming a full-time certified financial planner. So Dr. Greenwald, welcome, and thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to answering questions that might be helpful to your listeners.
First question, I guess, is just about your story there. What made you switch from a medical career into financial planning?
I think it was multifactorial. So back in the late 90s, my wife and I had 3 young children. My wife is a physician as well. She's double boarded in radiation oncology and also in hospice palliative care. And we were finding the 2-physician, 3-child household difficult to balance. In addition, managed care came early to Minnesota, and I particularly was feeling the effects of that. And we sort of looked ahead and wondered if it made sense to have both of our careers tied to medicine. So while I was practicing full-time, I passed all the courses for the CFP exam and also passed the exam. In 1998, I went part-time to financial planning. I practiced medicine 3 days a week and did financial planning 2 days a week. And then in 2000, I made the full-time switch, and I haven't seen a patient since 2000, although I keep up my Minnesota license.
So you made the transition back in 2000, and so for going on 17 years now, you've been full-time in financial planning. Obviously, it must be going well. You're doing it for this long. What are some of the advice that you can give our guests? As one of the things that I thought about when I first got out of residency was you hear your attendings talking about what should I be looking for in a financial planner? When should I be planning? So let's start with the first question. When should a medical student, a physician, when should they seek out the help of a financial planner?
That's a good question. We speak fairly often to resident group, fellow groups, etc. And we're often asked at the end, when should I start paying attention to this sort of stuff? And also, how should I go about choosing a financial planner? The answer is I would certainly start paying attention to this in residency. I've met with some medical students, and I'm not sure how helpful I'm able to be to them because, as you know, they're pretty much just spending money. And the best advice to them, which they already know, hopefully, is, try to spend as little as you can and come out with as little debt as you can. But obviously, that's easier said than done. And again, I don't think it takes a genius or an expert to pass that information along. When it comes to residents, there's definitely a large number of things that they can be doing from a financial planning point of view. First of all, they're employed, so they have a benefits package with life insurance and disability insurance and a retirement plan available to them usually. If possible, they should already be saving, even though they're making $50,000 or $55,000. There's no reason that they can't get going on a Roth IRA or other savings vehicles for retirement. Often they're married, their spouse makes more money, they have children, So my quick answer to your question is every resident should start thinking about financial planning, even if it's just 2 or 3 or 4 elementary, rudimentary things.
Good. And so going along with that, what should a resident or a young physician be looking for in a financial planner? I notice you have the CFP designation, which is one of the alphabet soup of designations that most residents don't really know, So if you could explain that and then just kind of what qualities you would look for.
You're right. There is an alphabet soup of designations, some of which have real meaning and some of which are just 3 or 4 letters that people put after their name to look good. What I usually recommend is that they look for a CFP, and this is not to be self-serving. There are 60 or 70,000 CFPs in the country, so we're not that rare. There's a number of reasons to look for a CFP. One is that in order to become a CFP, you have to pass the equivalent of 6 college courses on various aspects of financial planning, insurance, estate planning, investments, etc. You also have to pass an exam, an all-day exam that's rather rigorous, and the pass rate is about 60%. So first off, you have some assurance that the advisor you're working with has a knowledge base. More importantly, a CFP is held to a fiduciary standard. And luckily, the idea of what a fiduciary is becoming more widely known, especially now with the Department of Labor regulations. But I'm just going to go into it briefly. A fiduciary standard, which all CFPs are held to, means that we have to put our clients' interests first. So often when I say that to residents or physicians in general, they look at me kind of puzzled. Well, what does that mean? I'm a physician. Of course, I put my patient's interests first. Unfortunately, in this business, not all advisors are held to that standard. So if I'm looking for a financial planner, I would certainly want to start with one who has got my interests ahead of their own. They're going to recommend things to me that don't necessarily line their pocket, but are what's best for me as their consumer. So CFP, fiduciary standard, those would be bedrock things. Beyond that, I would certainly look for somebody who has expertise in working with physicians. I don't think that it's necessary to work with people like myself or others around the country who only work with physicians. I don't think that's necessary. But you don't want somebody who's, oh yeah, I used to work with a physician, but they moved to California. You want somebody who has some understanding of a physician's life, the challenges they face, their earnings potential, a lot of aspects that go along with being a physician. You want them to have some familiarity with that. And I would absolutely ask them, what percentage of your practice is made up of physicians? And maybe if you're a young physician, you may want to ask what percentage of your practice is made up of young physicians, et cetera. So make sure that they're not learning on you, that they've got some experience with working with people like you.
It's good advice, definitely. And thanks for explaining the fiduciary. Absolutely, it's been in the news lately, and I know that you're right. More people are aware, and whether the rules seem to change one way or the other, the trend is definitely people at least being aware, and therefore I think they'll make better judgments for themselves just by being aware of the differences between fiduciaries and non-fiduciaries. So one of the things that comes to mind for a lot of people are the steps they should take. So you mentioned as a resident, they should definitely be looking at the Roth IRA and then potentially the other parts of their benefits package. So if you could maybe go through, I have a list of the different type of accounts here that residents and employed physicians also, for the most part, have access to. So you mentioned the Roth IRA. Can you go into a little bit more detail about why that is an important thing for residents and probably all physicians to participate in if they can?
Sure. So there are two different kinds of IRA, and IRA stands for individual retirement account. A traditional IRA is very similar in some respects to the 401k or the 403b that folks know from being employed. They're similar in that with a traditional IRA or with a 401k or a 403b, the money that is put into those accounts is pre-tax money. It then grows tax deferred while they're working. And when they are retired, 59 and a half or older, and they take the money out of the account, it's taxed at that time as though it were ordinary income. So the idea behind those sorts of accounts is I'm in a lower tax bracket now. Once I get out into practice and I'm making a lot of money, I'll be in a higher tax bracket. And then when I'm in retirement, I'll presumably be in a lower tax bracket. So particularly for those in high tax brackets, being able to say pre-tax is an advantage. On the other hand, a Roth IRA is different. There are also available to many people a Roth option within their 401k or their 403b. So it gets a little confusing with the nomenclature, but with a Roth account, the money that goes in is after tax, and then it's never taxed again. Even when they take it out in retirement to spend to replace their income, there's no tax due at that time. What we like to see our clients do is we like to see tax diversification, because a lot of figuring out, well, is a Roth better for me or is a pre-tax account better for me? It depends upon what tax rates are going to be 20, 30, 40 years from now, and nobody knows that. So it's a good idea to have money in different buckets so that when it comes time to take the money out, you can choose, this year I'll take more money out of my Roth, I'm going to be in a higher tax bracket, et cetera. It'll give you diversification when you're taking money out. A rule of thumb is that the younger you are and the lower your tax bracket, the more attractive the Roth option is. So for residents, generally being young, generally being in a low tax bracket, often they're more favorable for residents, although they can often make sense for folks in retirement as well. What a lot of people don't appreciate is that if you look online, you'll see that the Roth IRA theoretically is not available to physicians in practice because there are income limits, and most physicians on paper make too much money to put money into a Roth IRA. On the other hand, there's a way around that, something called the backdoor Roth IRA, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into detail on this. It's very easy to look it up online. But using a backdoor Roth IRA strategy, which is perfectly legal, is a way that even high earners can put $5,500 a year per person. So if you're married, it's $5,500 for each of you into a Roth IRA. And actually, if you're 50 or older, it's $6,500. So a husband and wife who are both 50 or older could put $13,000 a year into Roth IRAs.
So as we were talking about these different retirement accounts, you talked about the 401k, 403b, the Roth, and the traditional IRA. There's also at many places the 457. Are you familiar with those? And can you talk a little bit about those?
A 457 is in some ways similar to a 403b or a 401k in that it allows pre-tax deferral. What makes a 457 different or significantly different in my mind is that with the 457 by law, there is what's called a substantial risk of forfeiture. So what does that mean? If you put money into a 401k or a 403b, those are very highly protected types of accounts that are governed by ERISA, which again is just codified in law and provides significant protection. If you put money into a 457 account, usually up to $18,000 a year, that money actually becomes an asset of your employers. And if they were to go bankrupt, you would be a creditor, just like all the other creditors, lining up to get your own money back from your employer. So if a 457 is available to a client, I have this discussion with them. Many of them, particularly the young ones, are reluctant to put money into an account that they won't be able to touch for many years, and there's a chance that the money will go away. We really use these plans extensively with our clients who are within, say, 5 years of retirement. Probably a lot or all college expenses are behind them. They've got really good cash flow, and they're in a high tax bracket. So they're looking for ways to top off their retirement accounts when they're close to being done with working. And again, the substantial risk of forfeiture becomes less of an issue because their money is not going to be tied up for 20 or 30 years. It's only going to be tied up for however many more years they plan to work at that employer.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of a mixed bag with that. It is, you can defer some taxes, but obviously, like you said, there is the risk of forfeiture. And so there's no real cut and dry rule on 457s. But thanks for clarifying that. That was very helpful. So one of the things that residents, obviously it's virtually impossible for most residents to max out all these account types, in addition to paying back loans, which seem to be growing at an astronomical rate. So in your mind, what would you recommend a resident? Obviously, the Roth IRA seems to be the first and foremost thing. But beyond that, would you recommend them contributing to a retirement account? Would you say pay back your loans, a mixture of both? What are your thoughts?
First off, in my mind, it depends upon what interest rate their student loans are at. We've seen interest rates between, say, 7 and 8%. If they have interest rates at 8%, it's hard for me to see even why they would do a Roth IRA. Because if they have $5,000 and their choice is put it in a Roth IRA or use it to pay back 8% debt, if they pay back 8% debt, that's the same as getting a guaranteed 8% after-tax rate of return. And there is no investment that will do that. So sometimes paying off high interest rate debt is best. What we've been seeing with a lot of our clients new to practice and even some of the residents and fellows is this whole world of refinancing your loans, which has opened up, which has been marvelous. So folks with high interest rate loans have been able to refinance to significantly lower rates. So that also can change the calculus. To get back to the question you asked me, though, one thing has to do with whether the retirement plan at the residency has a match or not. If the retirement plan has a match, that can be a pretty powerful reason to start your deferral there because you'll get free money from your residency in the form of the match. So we often recommend that residents defer to the retirement plan at work up to the match and then switch over to funding the Roth IRA up to the $5,500. And if they can go back and do more in the retirement plan at work, they should. So the rule of thumb that we use for all of our clients is the goal should be to save at least 20% of your gross income. And actually, there's good literature that supports that in the financial planning literature by a guy named Wade Pfau, Pfau. he's done good studies that show you want to be saving at least 15% of your gross income. And in my rule of thumb is that since physicians get such a late start on saving, we like to see our clients saving at least 20% of gross income. So whether it's retirement plans at work, whether it's Roth IRA, whether it's paying off high interest rate debt, they should be shooting for at least 20% of gross.
And actually, along those lines, so usually once you get out of residency or fellowship and your income jumps up significantly, a lot of people recommend still to live like a resident at that point so you can pay off your debts and save. But it's much harder to actually do in real life than in the literature.
That is certainly the secret to success. So again, when I talk to residents, I talk about all the time. We have clients who are subspecialists, and either one or both folks are physicians. They can be making $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, $1 million. And sometimes they're not as successful with their finances as, the family practitioner with a stay-at-home spouse who's making $250,000. So it all gets back to living below your means. You can make $700,000 or $800,000 disappear pretty quickly because, first of all, taxes are significant. You own a nice home, you own a nice vacation home, you drive the latest model, fancy cars, you take great trips to Europe, and, $800,000 doesn't go as far as it used to. So absolutely, living below your means is the key. And I wouldn't say that, you need to continue to live the resident lifestyle, but certainly somewhere in between the resident lifestyle and the lifestyle that $800,000 could support is a key. And again, Maya and I just finished speaking to a resident group last week or 2 weeks ago, and I got a lot of pushback from one of them where I said, one of the big mistakes we see doctors do when they go out into practice is buy a big house, because a big house means big property taxes. It costs more when you replace the roof. It costs more every time you paint it, etc. And this person was of the opinion that, a house is a good investment and someday you'll be able to sell it for $1 million. No financial planner would tell you that your primary residence is a good investment. I've never seen it in the literature. Financial planning considers your house a use asset. So absolutely something you have to have. You have to have shelter. You got to have a place to bring up your family, etc. But it's not a good investment. And it can be a huge pitfall because it can suck up money that should be going to retirement savings. Absolutely.
I personally experienced that when I was in the Air Force. My first house out of residency, we bought and lived in an area which suffered a big drop during the economic downturn. So absolutely, house is not an investment. Your primary residence should not be considered an investment. That's very good advice. So when we're talking about the savings rate, practicing physicians usually are able to maximize their IRAs, their Roths, and to a degree, they also have access to additional taxable accounts. If they have children, 529 account. I guess you don't even have to have children to have a 529 account, but more potential for savings there. So what is your advice in terms of giving to young physicians who are just out of residency, but now have that additional income and still want to save, more? They're being marketed to quite a bit now because obviously people know physicians have higher incomes. So what are your advice to them as far as where they should go next once they've maximized the retirement plans at work?
Well, again, not to be self-serving, and I will answer your question, but at that point, I would certainly, if they haven't already, they should be with a financial advisor. In my experience, young physicians, new to practice, there's all the work and stress of practice. They have a young family. The vast majority don't have the time or the expertise to be doing this. And a little bit of good advice and a little bit of doing the right things and getting off on the right foot makes a huge difference. To answer your question, again, it gets back to, first of all, I would look at their debt. How much debt do they have and what interest rate is it at? As you know, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, interest rates have varied anywhere from 2.8% to 7.8%. So there's a big difference between those, and that whether you have high interest rate debt or low interest rate debt is going to a large degree, determine a lot of the other answers as far as what to do with cash flow. Another thing to look at, particularly if you have high interest rate debt, is the refinance market, which, as I mentioned earlier, has really dramatically changed over the last 2 or 3 years. And refinances are available at very attractive rates, and that was never the case before. You were stuck with your high interest rate debt. So that's another area I would look long and hard at is can I refinance, and what does that look like? Make sure to build up an emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of living expenses in a liquid account, even though it may only be earning 1%. That's a good thing to do. Maximize the retirement plans at work. So the 403B or the 401k, I would definitely take full advantage and put the $18,000 in. You mentioned 529s for college saving. That's important, but that's separate from the 20% that we think should be going to retirement savings. So those are two different savings goals. And so that takes us down a whole different path with the, how do you save for college for children? So look at your debt, build up an emergency fund, max out the retirement plans at work, take advantage of the Roth. Something we haven't touched on is make sure you have enough insurance. For a young physician with young kids, disability and life insurance are critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I spoke to a previous guest about those type of things, but absolutely, life insurance, I think, is underestimated by most young physicians just because you have the mentality of, even though you're around sick and dying patients, you have the mentality of I'm young, I'm fine, I'm indestructible. But that's the best time to get insurance.
Right. So the I'm young, I'm indestructible applies to life insurance. It applies, I've seen, even more so to disability insurance. Nobody can imagine themselves being disabled. Or I shouldn't say that. Surgeons and those who use their hands and eyes, etc., it's a little bit easier for them to imagine being disabled. But for an internist or a psychiatrist, they just, what do you mean I could be disabled? What do you mean I might not be able to practice? I'd have to be practically dead. Well, actually not. There are a lot of circumstances in which people, anyway, so I'm not going to go off, but the disability and the life insurance are critical.
Absolutely. Good advice. And then just in general, so this kind of ties in a little bit, but what are some of the, you've been doing this for a while, you've seen physicians come with successful habits and then also, like you said, people who maybe weren't quite as successful. What are some of the things that you see that seems to be common mistakes from physicians of all ages? Well,
again, not to beat a dead horse, but the living below your means is everything. If you don't save enough, you can't make it up by getting a higher return. It just doesn't work. You have to be saving enough toward your goals to make it work. Other things are, I've certainly seen folks who have made bad investments. So it's interesting. I have a client who just retired. He's only been with me, I'd say 2 or 3 years. And he sold his practice with a big gain, at which time he told me, oh, yes, I've never told you, but I have a $200,000 tax loss carry forward because I invested in sort of a high flyer business and lost all that money. So, the good news is he gets the tax deduction for the $200,000 loss. The bad news is that he made a silly investment, which if he'd been working with a financial advisor at the time and had listened to them, that wouldn't have happened. So $200,000 is not an insignificant amount of money. So that would be a second thing, is making because as you pointed out earlier, physicians are often targeted because people assume they have lots of money, whether that's true or not, but they get targeted for things that are not always in their best interest.
It's true. Now, one of the things that I saw on your website about Greenwald Wealth Management was life planning. Can you explain what that is and what you do with that?
Yeah. Life planning. Mai is more of an expert at this than I am, but life planning is a movement in the financial planning field that's come about in the last 15 or 20 years. There are 2 or 3 advisors who separately and then at times together realized that to be a good financial planner, it isn't all about money and taxes and insurance, etc. That it's important to tie people's financial lives to what brings them happiness and fulfillment. So if you've got a client who's making $1 million a year and working as hard as they can, and they come to you and they say, you've got to get me out of this in 3 years. I can't work beyond 3 years. To be a good financial planner would mean taking a step back and helping them, what's going on in your life that you're so miserable? Why do you think that, being done with that is the cure for this? So life planning, I learned from my mentor, George Kinder, who's one of the fathers of life planning. It's a process that we take clients through that helps match their financial goals to their life goals and their happiness. I particularly have found it useful at turning points in physicians' careers. So, for instance, I have a client who, two-physician household, they late in life had children unexpectedly. They were very happy about this, but they hadn't thought it was going to happen. And one of them was very unhappy going to work, but sort of felt compelled to keep going to work because, after all, I'm a physician. I did all this training, when absolutely the best thing for them was to stay home. And their spouse gave them permission. They said, we make enough money that you don't need to work. And through life planning, they were able to see, when they ranked what was important to them, faith in the Lord, their community, their children, their husband, they enumerated through the life planning process all the things that were important to them. And then it dawned on them, without my even needing to point it out, nowhere on there was practicing medicine. And that's when they realized, I shouldn't keep doing this out of a sense of obligation if it's not the best thing for me and my family. I have another client who was working with me who, every time he was asked by his wife or anybody else, when are you going to retire? He would say 18 months to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. And that just kept going on. And in some way, his life was on hold because, he had a very busy practice. His wife's life was on hold because she was waiting for him to retire, but he wasn't getting a day closer to it. And by being able to do life planning with them, going through that process transformed their lives. They are retired, they are happy, they are doing all the things that they put down in their life plan that they wanted to do. But for whatever reason, he was stuck in 18 months to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. So those are the sorts of situations that I have found life planning to be. So to be honest, you mentioned before the 3-letter acronyms after our names. I have a lot that I don't use. And one of them that I considered using is the RLP designation, which is a registered life planner. And the reason I considered using it is a lot of work to get it. Truly, it's not one of these things that you do a continuing ed for an hour and have the designation. And it's also very powerful. So honestly, if people are interested in life planning, I would recommend they go to George Kinder's website. On there, you can find other registered life planners who take that more holistic approach to financial planning.
Wow, that's great. I didn't really know anything about it till I was on your website. So thank you. That's very informative. Any more advice that you can give our young listeners other than the take-home point?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is the following. You started to allude to this earlier. I'm not going too far, I don't think, when I say there are people in my industry who are predatory. They seek out young physicians and they sell them things they don't need, and they give them advice that's not in the physician's best interest. And that to me is shameful and distressing and saddens me and all sorts of things. So something that's becoming more popular in the industry and a great way for financial advisors to work with young physicians is on a retainer basis. So rather than the financial advisor having to sell some product to the client, whole life insurance or an annuity or who knows what, on a commission, not that there's anything wrong necessarily by default with commissions, but the retainer way of working with clients is the client pays, say, $1,000 to get onboarded, because that's usually a lot of work, and then $100 or $150 or $200 a month, depending upon how complicated they are. And they're getting unbiased fiduciary financial advice on all the things we've been talking about: how to take best advantage of their employee benefits, getting estate planning done, help with cash flow and budgeting, debt management and refinancing. So the retainer way of working in the financial planning business is relatively new, but to me, it just is such a great match for physicians new in practice who don't have a lot of assets for an advisor to manage. The advisor has to get paid fairly, and the client wants unbiased advice. So I would definitely have them look for fee-based advisors who are currently working on a retainer basis.
That's good. I've heard the terms fee-based, fixed fee, and stuff like that, but the retainer concept seems like a very good way for you to get the advice, even though, like you said, you don't necessarily have the assets yet. Well, thank you very much. This was very informative, and I appreciate you being on the podcast. Where can our physicians and our listeners find out more information about you?
It's simple. Just Google Greenwald Wealth Management. We're in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, but we have clients all over the country. We have clients who started their relationship with us when they were in Minnesota and have moved elsewhere. And we also have clients who have started their relationship with us wherever they live and will probably never meet, but we Skype every 6 months, and they seem to be happy with it. So that's another trend, obviously, in lots of areas in our society, but there's no reason you have to be in the same town as your financial advisor. And that's particularly true. I see this sometimes with clients who are in smaller towns in Minnesota, either for confidentiality reasons or just because the pool is limited. They'd prefer to work with somebody who's not in their hometown.
That's true. Absolutely. The internet has made a lot of these type of things much more possible. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Greenwald. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for listening to episode 2 of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. Thanks again to our guest, Dr. Joel Greenwald of Greenwald Wealth Management. Great information and insight from Dr. Greenwald about the basics of financial planning. Whether you choose to use a planner or not, it's good to know that there are experts like him to help guide you when you need one. One quick take-home point: try to save at least 20% of your gross income, if not more, when you first finish training. It sounds painful, but if you do it early on, you won't miss it and you'll thank yourself later. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a positive review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and let your colleagues know about this podcast. If you have some constructive criticism, please send an email to comments@drmoneymatters.com, all spelled out. And also send us ideas for topics or guests for our future shows. Please remember that what you've heard on this show is for your entertainment and education only. Speak with the appropriate experts prior to making decisions regarding your own financial situation. I'm adding a new feature to our website. After you listen to these episodes, go to the website to answer a couple of simple questions regarding the topics discussed on the episode. You'll get a certificate of continuing education, which is not sanctioned by anyone and is completely fake. But hey, it's free. Thanks again for listening, and look for episode 3 with Ike Davji, an attorney in Phoenix, Arizona, who specializes in asset protection. We live in a highly litigious society, and all you've worked for can be taken away without the proper coverage. Ike's a great speaker who's written many articles and given many talks to healthcare professionals on this important yet underappreciated top aspect of financial planning.